Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Valerie Estelle Frankel's pop culture critical theory book, Superheroines and the Epic Journey. This book, I think, for me, I'm using this for research, right? I'm currently working on a chapter for an edited collection that is dealing with the intersections of mythology, specifically the Egyptian Osiris myth, and a superhero comic. And this book was kind of a disappointment as far as developing a theory of superhero mythology, which is really what I was interested in with this. That's not to say that it's bad. It just, for me as a critical scholar who is primarily interested in this as critical scholarship, it fell short of what I was hoping for. So the basic premise of Frankel's argument is essentially that, so I would say it's essentially sort of twofold. One is that we can build from Joseph Campbell's Monomyth, this idea from the hero with 1,000 faces, that there's a basic structure and set of events that occur within epics as such, right? That is, within epic tales like the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Iliad and the Odyssey of Homer, the Aeneid of Virgil, the Epic of Beowulf, etc., right? Up through modern things like the Hobbit or the Lord of the Rings cycle, things like this, right? So there's a basic set of fundamental components. Now, Frankel asserts that the heroine's monomyth, or the heroine's journey, has a related but slightly different trajectory to the hero's journey, which is really what Campbell is concerned with. So that's the first phase of Frankel's argument. And basically what she says here is, though movie makers haven't brought it in nearly as much, the heroine's journey is not so different. So she's not arguing that it's different, but it is slightly different, right? The heroine has different gifts, a weapon that's often more chalice, ring, or magical cord than sword, parentheses, Supergirl's ship, Vixen's totem, the Witchblade gauntlet, Wonder Woman's bracelets, girdle, tiara, and lasso, close parentheses. Often she trains with the Wicked Witch rather than the more modern fairy godmother, or the boy's kindly Obi-Wan/Dumbledore mentor, while the hero meets the mystical goddess for his mate. The heroine's lover is the shapeshifter, always transforming, never fully trustworthy, parentheses, it's no accident that film Black Widow falls for the Hulk, close parentheses. The immature heroine, too, descends to death and faces her shadow, but this is the Wicked Witch, killer of the innocent, that the heroine quests to protect. She returns to life with new wisdom, finally prepared for the challenges of adulthood. And then Frankel notes, in parentheses, all this appears in more detail in my From Girl to Goddess, the heroine's journey in myth and legend. I'm willing to accept that premise, right? I'm willing to accept that. In a separate book, Frankel has developed this argument more. That's about all that we really get in this book about that, right? About the idea of the heroine's journey as slightly distinct from but related to the hero's journey in Joseph Campbell. So that's one phase of Frankel's argument that is, I would say, not developed fully in this book. Apparently it is developed in a different book, and I'm okay with that, right? That's not the point of this book, so she doesn't have to spend a ton of time going back over ground she's already gone over. But the second major phase of Frankel's argument is that this form of the heroine's journey largely maps onto superheroine narratives. That female superheroes or superheroines, whichever term you prefer, reflect in a sort of broad cross-genre sense the phases of the heroine's journey, right? So superheroines reflect the movement of the heroine's journey. That's essentially, ultimately, Frankel's key argument here. And she moves through a number of different points here, right? The specific chapters are broken up between these different sort of phases of a journey. So we got different chapters: growing up, superhero tools, family foils, male influences, descent to the self, facing the shadow, and motherhood and enlightenment. And they kind of generally map onto the phases of the heroine's journey, right? Or the hero's journey from Joseph Campbell, modified through the feminist or female storytelling lens. So we have things like in growing up, we have hero birth, the ordinary world, adolescence, call to rescue, refusal of the call, making the choice. And it's these kinds of things, right? These kinds of tropes or myth themes or what have you that organize the book. And that all makes sense as far as it goes, right? Structurally, cool. I'm on board with it. I understand the way that it's set up. The problem that I have with it is within the chapters themselves, or within the sub-chapters, the subsections. Because there's not any real theoretical development here. What we get is largely examples that are meant to be illustrative of the element of the monomyth, but they're not analytical. They are narrative without really being analytical, or I would say argumentative. So in the subsection on hero birth, for instance, like you can see right here, the way that they're set up, we have the name of the subchapter and then the name of the heroine, Wonder Woman, DC Comics 1941. So the particular instance in which this occurs, where the focus is here. The subchapter basically just sort of talks about Wonder Woman's birth and the sort of magical or heroic elements of it. But it doesn't analyze it in any depth. It doesn't analyze it in terms of like, here is how this connects with and reflects the elements of the heroine monomyth. We don't get that sort of analytical or argumentative explanation. And it doesn't just talk about Wonder Woman, right? It talks about Wonder Woman is the primary focus of that subsection in the way that, for instance, Supergirl is the primary focus of Secret Identity, Spider-Woman is the primary focus of Brutal Patriarchy, Batgirl is the primary focus of Finding the Mother, etc., etc. But Frankel also says, here are a few other additional examples of this. And she just sort of, again, tells these stories of these characters without really saying, here is what this tells us about the larger analytical approach that we would want to take to understanding superheroines and the epic journey. So that's one problem with it. The other problem with this approach, in my view, is that because it lacks that analytical component where it's really making a developed critical argument, the other real problem is that the book doesn't particularly account for all of the superheroines that don't fit with a particular trope of the epic journey, right? So all of the superheroines who don't have a heroic birth, or who don't seek some sort of connection with the mother figure, what does that mean, right? And this becomes part of the problem. And we saw this to a certain extent with, for instance, Andrew Ballman's The Mythology of the Superhero, which I've done a video about previously. This idea of like, here's a set of myth themes that are characteristic of superhero media, but some superheroes don't fulfill the myth themes, and some non-superheroic characters fulfill some of the myth themes. So it's like, okay, this is an analytical framework, but if it doesn't apply to all superhero characters and does apply to some non-superhero characters, how precisely does it work? And I think we run into the same kind of problem with Frankel, is we have these characteristics of the superheroine's epic journey, the superheroine's monomyth, but they don't apply to all superheroines, and they apply to some non-superheroines. And so it's hard, I think, to really say this is a useful framework for understanding the subject matter.